Welcome back to a year of Final Fantasy, and we are in the month of
Diablos.
And we are about to embark on somewhat of a side quest of sorts, talking about the Final Fantasy Legend series, which itself consists of 3 games which were released on the Game Boy. Before we get started with Final Fantasy Legend though, let's go over our jobs real fast. The first one that we're going to be talking about is the Monk. Now, I believe we've already talked about the Monk a little bit before whenever we did our holy sextet of jobs. The Monk appeared in the original Final Fantasy, and the Monk is exactly what you would expect. He bites with his fists and hands and some other monk weapons as well. He also has a very high HP pool, but he doesn't have very high defense, so that high life count will offset that. The Final Fantasy Legend series is interesting because it doesn't really officially belong to the Final Fantasy franchise, but was given the name to bolster sales of the new series. At least that's the commonly held belief. So if it's not part of the Final Fantasy series, then what series does it actually belong to? Well, that series is known as the Saga franchise. The first game was released in December 1989 in Japan on the Game Boy, and that was the first RPG for the system. Legend was then released in America in the next year. The Saga series is indeed similar to Final Fantasy in that it's kind of structured similarly, in that you have turn-based battles and party that you go around with and just similar Final Fantasy-isms like that. However, it differs quite a bit in the way the story is presented and the world itself is presented. Now, in Final Fantasy Legend 1, this particular game is presented a setting that is connected by a large tower. So the entire mythos of this game is centered by a large tower, and what this tower does is that it connects different worlds, and even though they call them different worlds, I always thought of them as maybe different planes of existence, if you want to go into a D&D aspect on that. Also to note is that these different worlds, time actually flows at different paces, which allows for different technological eras to be present. So for instance, one of these worlds may be more akin to a fantasy world, like a high fantasy that you're familiar with a regular Final Fantasy game. However, you may go to these other worlds that are in ruins, that are like super technologically advanced. So it really does span the gamut of all of these different kinds of stories and ideas that they can tell with these different settings, all while tying them together with a central story. Now, this game features a more Final Fantasy I type of approach to building parties, but there are several different types of beings that can be in your party. These are humans, mutants, which are also called espers in the Japanese version. The mutants in America, we think of them as being, I don't know, some sort of mutated and deformed version of humans. These are more like elves, I always thought, like super kind of high magical beings, but it's up to you, whichever you want to think of. And last of the 3, you have monsters. So you have humans, mutants, and monsters, each kind of functioning, like I said, like a different class would in Final Fantasy. And of course, here I've already talked about the different technological eras, so along with that, you have different weapons that can be equipped, such as swords or axes. If you're in a more technologically advanced area, you may be able to find things such as plasma guns and chainsaws and similar stuff. Final Fantasy Legend and the Saga series just in general was designed to be a little bit more of a complex experience compared to your basic Final Fantasy game. As you might have already noticed, with the more advanced setting of the world and the game is presented in a more advanced way, you can get the feel from this without me, just explicitly telling you. The goal of Final Fantasy Legend, though, is to advance up to the tower where paradise lies, getting up to heaven. And as you advance up the tower, you gotta visit each of these different worlds or continents or whatever they call them, and then you're gonna be blocked and you have to go and adventure around these different worlds, figure out how to advance up into the next higher levels of the tower, rinse and repeat until you get to the top. So I want to take a little bit of time here, and we'll talk a little bit about the thief here, not very much because we've already talked about him before, but with the thief, he steals stuff as you might expect, and they've actually rolled the thief and ninja together in a lot of games. Most notably in the later years of Final Fantasy, the thief has been able to throw different items and do some damage, so you're gonna get some crossover with a thief and a ninja sometimes. But anyway, let's get back to Final Fantasy Legend. Square decided to develop this for the Game Boy as they had seen the success of Tetris and they basically knew it was an instant hit and they really wanted to take advantage of that momentum. And as they were developing the games, they initially wanted the game to be able to be finished in about 6 to 8 hours, and that was actually the time spent from going to or from Tokyo to or from Honolulu, Hawaii. They wanted people to be able to take this on a plane with them and get a full fleshed out story without having to spend the 20 or 30 hours or whatever. That being said, that the game, whenever you play it, it's actually a little bit more difficult than you would expect from, again, like I said, a Final Fantasy game. And that's because of the more complex experience that they were going for. So around that 6 or 8 hour mark, I'm not sure if they would have hit it. Maybe if you play the game multiple times. I haven't played it in a very, very long time, so I can't give you any personal first-hand information on the length of play in my experience, but I do remember it was a little bit shorter than Final Fantasy I, for instance. Of course, this being an early Square game, Nobuo Uematsu developed the music that you're going to hear as well. You'll notice that at least pretty much in all of the early Square years, you're going to see that Uematsu is basically the go-to man for that. This isn't anything that I haven't already talked about before, but you know, I just wanted to mention it. All in all, the Final Fantasy Legend was a worthy attempt at an RPG. For the Game Boy, there is a specialness to the game that can't be understated. It's even still actually referenced in semi-current culture, as Final Fantasy XIII's final boss was definitely a nod to the final boss of Final Fantasy Legend and the weakness, and that's all I'm going to say about that. If you want to look it up, you can, but it's pretty interesting that that was just kind of a nod to that, almost out of nowhere. But Legend certainly has its flaws, as most games do, but it is just a really incredibly interesting RPG in its own right, and it began another great franchise for Square, the Saga franchise. I don't want to understate that. The Saga franchise is a definite overlooked gem of Square's catalog. So if you're gonna go for something different and you want something old school, maybe give it a try. But that being said, next time on A Year of Final Fantasy in the month of Diablos, we're gonna continue with Legend 2, which is incredibly special to me, as it was my first ever Game Boy game. So until next time, Crystal Warriors, keep on gaming.